Welcome back to the Big Igloo Podcast.
Yes, sir.
Course Smart Theology, Dumb Dad Jokes. And we've got a bonus episode for you. We've been working our way through Hollywood heroes. Been talking about this idea of receive, reject, redeem. And if you've not gotten it by now, we're not endorsing certain things. We're not saying you should or should not watch these movies. But hopefully through the whole series, the one thing I hope has stood out to you is that there are ways that we can engage with our culture, even if we haven't seen these movies, that there are stories that are present. There are truths that are present. And we can have these meaningful conversations or engage our coworkers and challenge them to think deeply, because throughout all of these things, we've talked about how C.S. Lewis kind of had this idea of the true myth. Right? The true myth of Christianity, that he saw so many parallels in so many other stories. And that's the thing. We're just challenging people. And here's the deal. It doesn't even have to be Hollywood heroes, does it?
No,
right?
Not at all.
In fact, little bonus to Travis Johnson here, because this bonus episode is his idea. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about Spider-Man today because it's not in the book. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe Frank and Zach will, in the second edition, they'll consult you, Travis, on this. Because
the best superhero story out there, I think.
Well, see, now you're getting controversial here. Why do we got to do that? Yeah. We're picking superhero denominations. That's what's happening. No, but honestly, Travis, you came to me and you said, hey, Spider-Man's not covered in the book, but you kind of, as we're going through, you've seen some themes develop and stuff. And so we're going to get to that in a second. Did you have before we dive into that, because I want to talk about just some of our takeaways from this series, but did you have something to add before we jump into the Spider-Man thing?
No, absolutely. Again, what you said, it's not an endorsement of all these characters, but you learn to pick up on things of like, man, that's totally like the gospel right there. It's like in a secular film that we should reject. We should we should reject some things. We should redeem some things.
And there's some things we could receive, right? Certain things, And that's the thing. I guess as a pastor, even when I was doing youth ministry, John, think about this. Like, I would love it if at the time that my students, if they would just connect with the fact that every song is preaching some sort of message. And that's not like, I'm not saying you have to like ditch all of your music that's not Christian or whatnot, but are you aware that there are truth claims in the music, right? There are truth claims in the movie. And I guess for me, if our listeners or viewers, if they're going through this series, hopefully you're walking through life with an awareness. Man, even billboards in town have a message, right? They have truths, right, that they're trying to share. But let's talk about some of the takeaways or some of the things that just as we've kind of went through this whole series, and without going into each and every superhero, just what were some of the things that stood out to you or that you appreciated about going through this? So,
for me, I love the idea of perspective shifts. And a lot of it's like, looking at a secular state, you can complain about the way the world is, or you can change it. Yeah. And a lot of that starts with a perspective shift. And so I think it was an introduction to like looking at something and saying, this is what it is. So instead of complaining about it, let's shift it. Sure. Let's shift the culture. Let's shift the idea of it. Let's change the subject of witchcraft, which Harry Potter wears, and let's change it to where can we redeem it? Kind of like you guys were talking about. So I really enjoyed the perspective shift in my head even. Yeah. I mean, I like a lot of those movies. I haven't watched all of them, but I love a lot of those movies. Yeah. But I haven't looked at them in the light that we did. And so it was really fun to just shift my own perspective, even though I didn't have ill intent towards all of them or whatever. It was just fun to do that.
I love what you said there, John, and it just made me think about, as Christians, sometimes we can be more destructive than constructive, right? We can tear things down. And here's the thing. There are some things in our culture that need to be torn down. There are vain imaginations. There are things, Paul talks about empty philosophies that we need to go after. We need to be a challenge in the culture to say, hey, is that really true? Is that really the way things should be? Is that really, what happens if you take that idea to its logical conclusion? Yeah. But sometimes Christians, we can get really good at being critical. And can I just say something? That's the easiest thing in the world to do, is to be critical, right? But it's much harder to be constructive, right? And so destructive, yes, there's a time for wrecking balls, right? There's a time to destroy some things. But hopefully we're showing people that there has to be a way that we be constructive too. What do we stand for? Christians just can't be about everything that we're against.
Yeah.
We don't do that. Well, we don't do that. Well, we don't do, well, what do you do?
Right.
You know, what's the meeting place with culture? So what about you, Travis?
I was going to say engaging in the culture, like, learning those, because how many of our neighbors have went out and seen, you know, like all the Marvel films, and these are like pop culture that everybody seems to know. And so, engaging in it in a special way, and getting them to think about certain aspects of the gospel that present themselves in those stories. That, the big thing for me was, there was a philosopher, and I forget his name at this point, but we talked about if you gave him all of God's power,
right?
You know, what would he change? You said, I would change everything,
right?
But if I had God's wisdom with His power, I would change nothing,
right? And
just knowing that there's certain things that, that is like, man, and I'm going to get to that a little bit here with Spider-Man, but
good.
But it's so good to see some of those philosophies and things that play themselves out in movies. I mean, it kind of resonates with our heart. It gets our emotions up a little bit. Yeah. And then pairing that with the gospel, man, it's like, it's so powerful.
Yeah.
Right. And I was going to say, one thing I noticed even more, this is something that's always, I realized how much the story of Jesus is really in Hollywood in these days. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful story, so everybody wants to pull from it.
Greatest story ever told. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's really cool to like, even because now that we went over the series, I'll watch a movie and I'll look at it in that perspective. And it's just like, there's so many movies out there that pull from the story of Jesus, and they won't admit it.
Look at that, Travis. I got one of my students to do the thing. Hey. It took years later, but John's now watching movies the way I always wanted him to. Hey, Travis, you brought up that quote with that philosopher. It's interesting because I've gone back and I've watched some of these episodes, and I've watched every episode that we put back out. And that quote about, if I had all God's power, I would change everything. This is all things I would change, but if I had His wisdom, I would change nothing. And I remember in that just being blown away by that quote, and I still think it's a powerful quote because I think there's a place of humility for us. The one thing that kind of tripped me up, I think, as I've just been processing about it. And so again, as our viewers, I just want you to know, listen, we're processing these things in real time, and even if we throw statements out there's obviously nuance to different statements. But I thought about that of like, well, then what does that say? Because we are supposed to be on some level God's problem solvers in the world.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so there is a way in which we need to stand up to the injustice, but there is a tension there that exists in that quote. I just thought about that, just that there is that tension of like, there might be some things that we think need to change, sure, right? But God's like, actually, you don't have my perspective on this. And it's oddly enough, I was going through Habakkuk, right? One of those Bibles that a lot of people don't even pay attention to, right?
Know how to pronounce
how to pronounce it, and really, truly, nobody does because they don't even know the etymology of the word. But scholars argue over stuff like that. It's real fun debates. No, I don't stay up all night.
Habakkuk.
Well, there you go, right? And someone's like, "Well, it's Akkadian and blah blah blah." And I don't know. I don't have enough knowledge to weigh in on that. But and I'll probably say it both ways now. Habakkuk. I don't know. But that guy. What's going on is, at one point, Habakkuk is like looking all around, and he's like, God, I don't understand this. You're a God of justice, but how can you let all this? And he comes. Sure. I mean, he's wagging his finger in God's face. He stops short of blasphemy or stops short of like just completely turning and disbelieving God, but he is arguing with God. He is lamenting, and he's just like, it's infamously, that's where a lot of people will say things like, well, God can't even be in the presence of evil. And that's actually taken a verse out of context in Habakkuk. Because what Habakkuk is saying, he's saying, I know that you can't even look upon these things. He's kind of speaking metaphorically, hyperbolically, because he's like, you're too pure for this. I know who you are, but why do you make me see it? Basically, is what is the thrust of his complaint. And what's crazy is if you look at that, God says, I'm about to do something that you won't understand. Yeah. And this is just a little peel back the layers here. He said, I'm about to do something you understand. Even if I explain it to you, you won't understand. And then basically God tells him, I'm going to bring in the Babylonians, and the whole thing's going to happen. And Habakkuk's like, yeah, I don't understand that. I don't get it. What is crazy though, and I heard Tim Keller kind of unpack this a little bit, is that, those kingdoms that came in, Assyria, Babylon, right, Persia, you know, all these kingdoms came in. They're like building roads, they're building these cities and trade and all this kind of stuff. To ultimately, it culminates in the Roman Empire.
Sure.
And the dispersion of the Jews. So these Jews get pulled out and separated to all these different places.
Yeah.
Well, when you look at the time that Jesus dies and the missionary expansion starts happening, Paul's, you know, modus operandi, right? Like what Paul goes and does is he goes to a synagogue. What does he do? He goes into the dispersion, the place who have the common faith, right? He didn't just go minister right to Gentiles.
Sure.
He would go into a synagogue in a Gentile center. And if there were any believing Jews or people that connected with the message of Jesus, those are the people he started a church with.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is what Habakkuk could not see at his time was, the Babylonians were going to come in. They were going to disperse. There was going to be horrible things that would happen. But what Habakkuk could not see is that was going to pave the way for the message of Christianity to go. And then another thing that Tim Keller points out there is you have the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire and the Assyrians, some of the most brutal and violent, right? And again, culminating in the Roman Empire. But so you have the history of humanity that's so violent, and by the time Christ comes in, the message of Christianity spreads and the world becomes less violent.
Dang. Well, I was going to say, even just the explosion of the early church was that persecution that drove them
that scattered them. Yeah. I know. So those are some of those things. Again, that quote, I've just been processing on it more because I think it's hard to say I would do nothing or I'd leave things the way they are. I think there might be a fatalistic type way of looking at that where you're like, well, I'm not going to do anything because God's in control. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And there is a irresponsibility with the sovereignty of God that I don't think we want to brush up against. Right. But the sentiment of the quote, I still love, I still agree with, I still think it's humbling to say, I need the Spirit of God, right?
Yes.
To tell me what to do and what to pray for.
Absolutely.
So anyway,
cool.
Well, that was a nice little sidebar. So let's talk about Spider-Man. All right. So Travis, you're the one who brought this up. So where are we going with Spider-Man?
So Spider-Man has got I think the most films out of any superhero. We've got, so it started with, Tobey Maguire back in 2002, and he had 3 films. And then Andrew Garfield jumps into the scene on 20.
That's where I was out. I was like, I'm no more Spider-Man. There's too many Spider-Verses. I was out.
So another 2 films with Andrew Garfield.
Yeah.
And then Tom Holland comes on the scene. And he's got 6 movies, I think, with all of them. And so it's like Spider-Man is one of those things. And I love it. Like Stan Lee, when he was talking about creating Spider-Man, he wanted to break the mold a little bit he wanted something that is a little bit more relatable with people. And so obviously he does have his superpowers, but he's also a guy that struggles to pay rent, that he's constantly having trouble with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And so it's like a little bit more like, the
he's
everyday.
Just a young, everyday kind of kid.
Yeah.
I mean, really. Yeah.
And so the story goes that Spider-Man basically, he gets bit by this spider that gives him Spider-Man abilities.
Right.
But as they go through, and so every story has had this where Spider-Man loses somebody that he loves the most. And usually it's by his kind of his own hand of whether he doesn't act, when a burglar or thief is doing something, he has the ability to stop them, but he doesn't. And that ultimately that same person is who kills, Uncle Ben. And so, kind of with this, I wanted to kind of process through okay, what is it that makes Spider-Man Spider-Man? And they actually just released a new Spider-Man. It's kind of an animated across the Spider-Verse, and it kind of pulls on this thread a little bit of what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man.
Okay,
right.
I've not seen it, so
okay, so no spoilers, but
that's all right.
So with that knowing though, there
spoil away.
Spoil away.
Just let the viewers know, they might care.
Spoiler alert. Okay. Spoiler alert. Yeah, you proceed with caution. No, okay, but why is it that, Spider-Man becomes Spider-Man? It's because Uncle Ben, and basically Uncle Ben dies in his arms in every film. Or at least the start of every film.
Okay.
And so there's this kind of, what we call canon events.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Now I can explain biblical canon.
Yes.
Right. That's the books of the Bible that we have. We say the canon is a measure or standard, right? So that's they're in the Spider-Verse. Absolutely. There's Star Wars kind of has this too, right? Like there's approved or accepted narrative.
Yes.
If you will. Yeah.
There you go. So yeah. So it gets complicated with the multiverse, but
yes, it does.
It gets a little confusing. But so Spider-Man ultimately becomes who he becomes because basically looking at Uncle Ben, and it destroys kind of Spider-Man, who he is. Like, it's kind of a gut wrenching, like it's jolting, and it makes him basically shift his whole worldview based on this one event.
Yeah.
So I don't know, thinking about that.
Yeah.
I was gonna say the story of Joseph. And man, how many times, Joseph was pretty prideful in his young age.
Yeah.
And so, just thinking about Joseph, and okay, so what made Joseph be able to get to Egypt that eventually would save, basically his whole people. And it's like God weaving this story thread.
So let me ask you,
Yeah.
in all the stories, does he get his powers before his uncle dies?
It's after, right? Or is it before?
I think it's before, because isn't that when Ben says, "With great responsibility comes great power"?
Yeah.
Or with great power comes
You got it.
Yeah.
Flip it.
yeah.
Because here's what I find interesting. I love that you bring this up. I never thought about this, honestly. Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams, right? Well, he gets dreams first.
Yeah.
And he actually gets them right. But you think about in the patriarchal society that he has, now he's dad's favorite kid, right? Yeah. So he's already cocky because of that. I mean, there's arrogance there. And I mean, here's the thing. We should never approach that story of Joseph and be like, oh, they're the perfect family. No, they're not.
Yeah.
Joseph shouldn't be the favorite. You shouldn't have favorite kids, but he clearly is, right? Of course, you have the thing going on with the moms and, mom one and mom two, right? And dad and the servants and all that. So kids from all sorts of things. I mean, Jacob is not ruling his house well. Sure. I mean, there's a whole bunch of baggage with all that. But he does have the ability to interpret dreams. And what I find really interesting, that's why I asked about the superpower thing, because with Joseph, he gets this dream. So he's gifted by God to interpret dreams, but he kind of, he comes to his brothers first. So he says, oh, your sheaves of grain were bound down to mine. Then he gets the other dream where it's the sun, moon, and stars and the whole thing, which is interesting. The sun, moon, and stars and all that represents like spiritual authorities too. Sure. So he's talking about like the heavenly host and angels and all that, And so it's like his dad's like, oh, so you think I'm going to be too? It's like if the angel's going to be bound down to you, you think me too? So the one time that we see Jacob kind of puts him in his place, but then the horrific events. And that's what you're talking about, like a major, with Spider-Man, it's the death of Uncle Ben. This major catalytic event that happens and puts them on a path. Similar thing to Joseph. That's really interesting. John, do you have a thought?
I don't know. It kind of reminds me of, there's a few ways you can go to this. Obviously, the major event, as all Christians, that pushes it is Christ dying on the cross. But there's a few other ways that in our lives, I feel like that can represents a little bit. I think of baptism as a mark. It's a public mark. Like that was the day where you're like, okay, I'm committing to this bigger thing than me. Yeah. I don't know. It's just interesting that I think there's a lot of ways that could relate to us, or obviously the day that we give our lives to Christ. Yeah. There's a few ways that one event changed your whole perspective on life. Today in our staff meeting, we were talking about, took some students to Bold, and somebody's, Pastor Ron had said, well, this moment could have changed their whole life. And it's really the truth.
Very true.
Because I went to how many conferences with Chris? I signed every vow, went to every, altar call, all of it. And it just took the one moment that it was real to me, and it changed the rest of my life. I mean, my whole life has been 180'd since that moment. And so it really is, those one moments in our lives can really catapult us if we allow it to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and so, you brought up, Uncle Ben's kind of great famous saying that, with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah. And so, what does that mean for us as Christians? Yeah. Really wrestling with that. And so, and actually, I mean,
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So Luke 12. So Jesus is in the middle of, he's just, he kind of turned on the heels of there was a whole bunch of people, kind of gathering around, and he goes after the Pharisees, of kind of the leaven of the Pharisees, and just kind of basically calls them out for their hypocrisy of being people of God, but doing absolutely nothing and being dead inside. And so Jesus starts this story about the servants, and basically this master leaves his servants in charge of the house, and through this whole thing, there's certain servants that they're good. They stay watchful for the master's return. Yeah. And they manage the household well. And then there's other servants that knowing that the master is going to be delayed, they basically go in and wreak all kinds of havoc on the house.
Right.
And Jesus kind of finishes the whole story with this. But those who did not know and did not and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. So that's an interesting place to jump in. But everyone to whom much was given, of much of him will be required, and from him to whom they were entrusted much, they the demand will be more.
Jesus sounds like Uncle Ben there.
So a little bit.
It does, absolutely, right? Yeah.
And so thinking about that, of a life-changing event that basically Peter Parker, Spider-Man, encounters this world-shifting thing of like, he comes to realize that every small little thing matters.
Yes.
And so even stopping, in the Tobey Maguire film, there's basically a man that's just cheated Peter Parker of some money that he was owed. And the man gets robbed right in front of him. And the guy's like, why don't you stop the burglar? And he's like, not my problem. Basically saying you got exactly what you deserved.
Yeah.
And then this person is, ultimately this thief is the one that kills Uncle Ben. And so like there's this thing that like every little small thing matters. And so the people, the small little crimes, petty crimes, all of these things matter. And it's my responsibility to step up. Basically the powers that I've been given, it's now my responsibility to benefit others with them. And I think that echoes Jesus's message perfectly.
Absolutely.
Of like, we all have gifts that we've been given.
Yeah.
And so, what are we going to do with those gifts?
Yeah.
We should be looking to benefit others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting, jumping back to the story of Joseph, and I love this connection, because with Joseph, again, he kind of goes kind of off half-cocked, so to speak. He tells his brothers, then tells his father about these dreams. Of course, his brothers get mad. We know that whole thing, and it does put him on this trajectory. But what's crazy is, through the beating and probably through the time in slavery, I mean, he's getting humble pie, right?
Yeah.
And here's the thing: is like, clearly the actions of his brothers are evil, but at the same time, especially when you go to the end of the story of Joseph, it's like, their actions are evil, but again, God meant this for good. Those are Joseph's words. But what's nuts is, I think one of the times I was studying this, what's interesting is even when Pharaoh has the dreams, right? And he's like, can someone interpret? Oh, I got this guy. I know this guy I did some time with, and so he comes and grabs him, and Joseph's response is like, who can interpret dreams but God alone?
Which is interesting, because before, when he sent the cupbearer out, he said, remember me. Yeah. So it shifted from remember me to exalt the Lord. Yeah, it's true. And Joseph has passed some incredible tests. I mean, with Potiphar's wife, I mean, he is this man of integrity. We don't, outside of just maybe some, maybe his young, prideful days or whatever, being dad's favorite, like he does some honorable stuff. And because what's really nuts is like, especially with the whole thing with Potiphar, you see Joseph does the honorable and the right thing, right? And then what's crazy is the story. This is where our chapter divisions don't help us out, because the chapter division comes in, and next thing we see is Judah's incident with Tamar, where, she marries his oldest son, and then he dies, and then marries the next one, and he dies, and then he's got a younger one. He's like, wow, hold on, he's too young or whatever. And so she has to dress like a prostitute to seduce Judah. I mean, if you look at that whole thing, Judah was living in a place he shouldn't have been. He probably was married to a woman that he shouldn't be. Right. I mean, this whole, like, his sons were evil. Like, it's terrible. And so when you look at this whole issue of like sexual integrity, here Joseph has it. Yeah. He goes to prison, and Judah, one of his brothers, is out there living free, and he's doing the wrong thing. In fact, Tamar, who has to act like a prostitute, he says she's done more righteously than me, which is crazy. And then it cuts back to Joseph in a prison. So you've got this whole story of like, what in the world, but Joseph is on this path. He is on this arc. And I think we could say something with Spider-Man, that there is something purifying that happens through suffering. Yes. And I'm not saying we have to go out and look for suffering or beat ourselves to try to, I'm suffering, no, just trust me. You live in this world long enough, it finds you, right? Absolutely. And we need to stand against it, but at the same time, it does work something out in us. And I think a lot of superhero movies kind of portray that, honestly. Right. That there is kind of a purification that comes through these tragic events. Absolutely. It brings the scripture, count it as joy when you face trials. Yeah. Right. It's that idea of, yes, they're here, but where's the redemptive part of it? Just like we look through these Hollywood stories of what should we redeem, we should be looking at that through our own lives of, just for example, we just put some money in our car. I drive to North Platte for a wedding, and then at that wedding, our alternator went out. I was just like, I was like, Lord. It's like, Lord. I was like, just get me through this weekend, please. Like, that's all I said. Because it was right on the heels of Bold. And then my uncle, Michaela's uncle, which is my uncle. I'm still getting used to that whole thing, even though 4 years in. Anyways, he's a mechanic. I dropped it off with him, and I just had a moment to humble myself. I was like, sorry, Lord. Sorry, I was frustrated at you. Like, this is life. Why just because I feel like I've done a good service do I deserve more than a normal person? You know what I mean? It's what you've called us to. And so just this idea of, this redeeming process, even through our trials and tribulation, of how can we still praise and exalt the Lord? And that's what we saw in Joseph. It started out with him, it's about me, you're bowing to me. And he goes to Potiphar's wife, and you see some improvement. Then he goes to the cupbearer, and it's like, well, remember me. And it's just this ideology of, all great leadership. And this goes back to one of the OG ones, starts in humility. And that place of like, you're not above scrubbing the toilets at the church. You're not above serving the people. And, even Travis had a check with me. I was joking around with one of my mentors, and I was like, low man on the totem pole, you're on the cot. I was like, when we get a younger leader, you can sleep not on the cot. And Travis was like, hey, John. It's like that's not, I forget how you mentioned it, but he was in this way of like Jesus would have slept on the cot. I was like, yeah, I'm not Jesus. But it's this idea of, great leadership always starts in that place of humility. And that comes from a pastor or a superhero. And I think that's the overarching theme of all of it. If they all learned humility in some place or another.
Absolutely.
This kind of sums up also kind of this whole superhero series. We've talked a lot about power and how power is used and all that. I had a professor, Dr. Villacorta. Dr. Villacorta, he was awesome. I had him 2 or 3 classes, but great, just real heavy on spiritual formation. But I remember I took a class with him that was actually on power and how we use power. And he used to say, it was not a matter of if you will use power, but he would have this question: power for what purpose? Power for what purpose? We all have some measure of power, but power for what purpose? You will either use power to serve yourself, or you use power to serve others. And again, just as a Hollywood heroes theme, we like it when the heroes serve others. Back to Captain America, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Jesus is saying the same thing: to whom much is given, much is required. It's not for you, it's for others, but it's coming through you, and you will receive a blessing. And that's the thing. I think sometimes in Christianity, you got the blessing camp and the poverty camp or whatever, and it's like both of those are ditches. It's this idea that, does God want to bless you? Yes. Does God want to use you? Yes, but not to just promote you. He wants to get to others through you. And so it's power for what purpose? Did you have any other thoughts on Spider-Man?
I mean, so zooming out, obviously we get to see, obviously all these things that happen in Spider-Man's life that basically makes him, just it shapes, his decisions. And, we don't always get to see that in our own lives. But having zoom out, kind of a 10,000 foot view of like Joseph gets to see that. It was like,
that's true.
Brothers, you meant that for evil. But God meant that for good. And so that's, and it's Romans, God works all things, according to those who are, called, I just butchered that.
God works all things together for good for those who are called according to his purposes, right?
There you go. Yes.
And that, I would say that's also a mark of Christian maturity. If you can look at your life, and it's hard when you're in the middle of things, right? When you're in the middle of tragedy, when you're in the middle of injustice, right? I mean, and again, we're not calling unjust things just. We're not saying that. But we are saying that there is a sovereign hand in our lives where he is using things to shape us. And I think we've covered even before, just talking about, even with the crucifixion of Jesus, that Peter stands up and tells the people of Israel, you men of Israel who did what God predestined to occur. It's like, huh?
What?
Like what? But it's like, you're guilty, but God had a plan, right? Same thing with Joseph. You guys meant evil, but God had a plan. But it's a real mark of maturity if you can. And the thing of it is like, and I would say to you two who are younger than me, to start looking back over your life and start looking and journaling and writing signature events down, writing certain things down to be like, man, at the time I didn't realize how significant this was, but this put me on this path.
Yeah.
And it might not be huge things, but it might be just that person who came into your life that gave you a job, or that person who came in and spent a little time with you, whatever. Could be a coach. It could be something like that. And what will happen is, this is called, I forget where I came across this title, but it's called reverse sense making.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, it's looking back through your life. And what's amazing is if you just sit and just journal and think about these things, all of a sudden these patterns will emerge that you'll be like,
that's so good.
I've been walking on a road this whole time and I had no idea.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why I love the power of storytelling, the power of Spider-Man or any one of these other heroes is we see the path emerge, but they're in the middle of the story. They don't always see it.
Yeah.
Right.
Joseph was on a path that was set before him. And I'm not calling God a puppet master. No, people are making choices. This whole thing's happening. But God is also one who he knows the end from the beginning. Right. But there is a path that does emerge, and God can redeem it all.
So good.
Yeah.
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 That's
What do you think, John?
It's good.
All right. Well, I think that's about our time.
Yeah,
so
right on.
Right on. Well, hey, we certainly hope that you've enjoyed the Hollywood Heroes series, and I know we kind of briefly paused it with going through the Book of Ruth, but thanks for joining us. And hey, I want to shout out to Frank and Zach Turek for writing such a tremendous book. There is so much more stuff we didn't even cover that they go way deeper than what we could even do in a 30-minute podcast. So if you've liked any of the content, I'd encourage you to go out and support them. Frank Turek, Cross-Examine Ministries. It's a great ministry. So otherwise, like, subscribe, share our stuff. We'd love to see you back here, and we'll see you next time.
Deuces.